Well, thank you so much, Ernesto. We have half an hour for questions and answers. What I'm going to be doing is at first 15 minutes I'm going to take the questions, and the second 15 minutes I will ask our spokespersons to answer them. So if there are any questions, I think that they are hungry. There's a comment from André. I have a question for Paul. Seeing the performance of total productivity of factors in this last 30 years, there's an element that is quite cyclic. What is your opinion or of the OECD of the installed capacity indicators?
No, go ahead. Yes, I can tell André is very interested in this subject, and Dale Jorgensen was very clear about his. He thought, well, we shouldn't really bother about this. I think there are arguments for and against. Okay, and at the end, it comes down to how do you consider the services that capital provides? Because I mean, we're measuring the utilization. The output, of course, goes up and down with whatever happens in terms of economic activity. On the labor side, we're pretty good as well. If we measure input with hours worked, typically that reflects the degree of utilization of people over the cycle. But what about capital? And here, the one group of people would say, well, we should adjust for the fact that some of this capital just sits there, and certain machines don't run as many hours as they would in boom times. So we're mismeasuring the capital input if we don't adjust it. Then, of course, there's an issue of how should we adjust and which indicators to use. But that's a practical question. But there are other people, and probably this is where Dale would sit, who says, well, there's a lot of capital goods. They provide capital services, whether there's a boom or not. Think of a building, for example, that it provides shelter for machinery and people working in there, and the services that are provided by this building, they are pretty independent of the status of the business cycle. And I think the problem is to make the distinction between those capital goods where you would want to make an adjustment and those where you wouldn't want to do that. And so to me, I think it's more of an empirical issue of making that separation and then finding the right indicators to do the adjustment rather than a matter of principle.
My question is for Mr. Ernesto López. It called my attention that there is very little investment in training in companies in Mexico. And I relate that to the comment of the drop in the trading sector. I see this on the viewpoint of the small and middle-sized companies. How can you give incentives to this? I believe that they don't invest in it because they don't see the productivity or the benefit if they train their staff, especially in that kind of companies. How prudent will it be to give them incentive throughout the revenue service, like exemption of taxes or any other kind of incentive? We're going to take the next question. It's very specific. One of the campaign promises of President Peña Nieto comes from a proposal of Mr. Levy to bring down the cost of informality by giving universal health with a general tax and not and reducing the social load. For me, it was great because I think that definitely informality will not be reduced if the cost of formality is so high. So it would be very specific. I do have other thoughts though, but I will also like some other people to participate. Regarding training, I was looking for the numbers of the OECD that compare Mexico with member countries. We invest 20 times less if compared to the average of OECD countries. This is not only talking about the companies, but we have been focusing on public investment, on training at work. Maybe this is good for the topic related to unemployment insurance that is now being proposed. The idea is that the workers that underwrite this kind of insurance for unemployment can have access to active training policies. So, training would be a useful tool to provide the workers to be reemployed in other companies. It also implies how to articulate this training program so the companies themselves can undertake and they can invest in the human capital of the workers. Obviously, if we have a great number of informal companies, the incentives to invest on training are quite limited, such as in trading. But informal companies in sectors of more productivity, we do believe there is a space to improve. Talking about Social Security, well, I worked on the IDB. I know very well the proposals of Santiago Levy, and they are quite wise. The proposal that we have at the Pact for Mexico is a universal social security system, but we do not mention financing. So, in spite of the fact that Santiago Levy proposes that universal social security should be financed by consumption tax, is not what we have at the Pact of Mexico. So there's a discrepancy on that sense. In the current proposals of Social Security, there are elements that do foster formalization. There is a regime of incorporation of new small companies to the tax system that offers them reduction for Social Security contributions, low income employment will also have lower contributions, that is to foster them. Management load that we believe that is reflected in the proposal is also driven in that sense. So this is a path that we must walk through, but we do believe that we are on the right track. Paul, more than a question, this is a comment. Obviously, we know that we have applied an algorithm. And yes, it is true that we have the information as to develop that productivity. I think that we will be putting on efforts in doing so, in applying this algorithm to certain issues. But in environmental issues, in the case of Mexico, we have made efforts to apply the integrated environmental system, but we have a vision not only on physical terms, but also measured money-wise that could also help us to support the work that you are developing regarding the assessment on internationalization of inclusion or incorporation of natural resources. So if you consider wise, you could give us a methodologic idea and we will be more than glad to study it. The question is for André Hoffman, or maybe Paul, would you like to comment on what they've told you? The question is that Professor Jorgensen said this morning that there is a priority in the program that the INEGI has started that has to deal with homologating certain accounts with the EU claims that has to do with input prices. I don't know, could you give us a little bit more detail on the second part of the project? Well, I don't know exactly what Professor Jorgensen wanted to say with that, but yes, it is an important topic. In EU claims, when we still have a strong effort to do on homologation, and for AL claims, this is an issue. For instance, in the labor factor, we could have series for a certain period, but the different series for the different years will be different, and they cannot be compared. This kind of work that in Europe, in EU claims, it can be done because many of them are research centers, and in Latin America it is much more difficult, and in this case CEPAL or ECLAC does the linkage and not the country it says. So this topic that you are mentioning on homologation has its practical aspects, and that is the way that we try to address. Two more questions. And then Carlos? Well, thank you. More than a question, it's a comment. I am Arturo Blanques from INEGI. And in order to solve some concerns that have been expressed, and we thank you all for your recommendations, we have foreseen in a working program that the next year, at the end of the first quarter or second quarter, the databases will be available for what you have requested, but with the change of year basis on the new national account system. We had not done it before in order to avoid confusion before the previous base and the new base. So we, all the team is working on it in order to reach those dates with that data and help you more with the processes that you are undertaking. I would like to raise a question for André Hoffman. Maybe it could be of more general interest. The question is as follows. If a model that has gone with a real wage, what we have observed is that it is flat. Wages have been stagnated in spite of all the benefits that you have had on education and that have been reflected in the share of work in the accounting of growth. One could say this is a direct result of this crisis drop, but the real salary of of non-qualified workers has grown, and we see people coming back to school in the last 20 years. So more educated workers have better wages. But this is a fact that is studied by the World Bank, and it has been well studied. That's why the implications for accounting in productivity. We have a better educated population, but they don't have the benefit of better wages. But are you taking into account these returns to education when you are measuring human capital? If not so, couldn't you think that you would be underestimating human capital when you are making this accounting on productivity for the Latin American countries? Both.
Do you want me to respond?
Yes,
Okay.
please.
Well, I'll make three remarks. One that in response to a question that wasn't asked, but I think which I wanted to bring in, because it struck me when we saw the figures on productivity by industry, that I should underline that the measurement of output in some industries is still a very tough job. And I will mention two of them, which are kind of extreme in the way they come out. One is we, and when I say we, it is the international statistical community, are not very good at measuring the production of health, education, and social services. And those are big parts of our economies. Okay, and there's a lot happening in health. There's a lot of IT being used in health. There's big shifts between inpatients, outpatients. These services that are provided are not very well measured. And I mean, there's increasingly activity in the statistical offices to tackle those, but in general, there's a level of uncertainty there that we shouldn't forget, certainly when we interpret these industry-level data. The same is true for some industries that come out very high, in particular financial services. I mean, all those who have been tortured in the national accounts with what is called FISIM, or financial intermediation services indirectly measured. Excuse me with the interpreters for this, will know that this is very hard to capture. So that was my first remark, which I wanted to bring in. The second one is in response to the remarks on the environment. Yes, I really should have pointed out that Mexico is also a forerunner in the measurement and the implementation of a new international standard that deals with environmental and economic accounts, and actually has as an objective of bringing the information about the environment closer to the information that we have from the national accounts, make those consistent. Okay. But I think part of this is also to have a set of balance sheets that relate to natural resources. Some of those would be part of the national accounts, some of them would not be. And I think it would be a very logical way forward to try and recognize those that are part of the national accounts in the productivity calculation for, just to check whether it makes any difference. But it is true that Mexico has been one of the leaders in this area as well. I should also say that there is a small difference between recognizing the flow of natural resources into the economy. There we are only talking about some added inputs that are coming in, and and yet another question that has to do with the social costs of say pollution. Okay, I wasn't talking about this at all. That is much more in the environmental field. It's an interesting but somewhat different question. The third remark relates to this question of input prices that Dale alluded to. I think here the challenge is simply to have information on labor input, that is hours worked, that is sufficiently disaggregated by those attributes of labor input that we think are important for productivity. And I mean, education is one, but skills more generally is other. Work experience is a third. And having this data available and the relative wages that come along is something that is hard to construct and needs a lot of microdata and imputations and so on. And I think that was the discussion that this was all about. And let me just finish by saying again how much I appreciate the work that Ignacio has been doing. I mean, as someone who has been dealing with these measures, I know in what kind of complexities you enter when you I mean, this is exponential, okay? When you have several sectors, you have time, you have industries, services, it explodes. So I congratulate again for having mastered that task.
Thank you. André?
With regards to the question on employment, the first observation, is that we're in a better world. The growth, used to take hours as amount. Now it's income, which is consistent with the national account system. Per gender, educational level, and age groups. Therefore, the theme in this case is better, is easier to study than before. I think that the second point to consider is Paul mentioned something about this, and so does Dale, that perhaps in the measurement of income and components, we need to have an improvement, and this could lead to other results. However, in general terms, I think that this theme can be better studied. So I invite you to use the database to see if your results change or not. Well, thank you all our speakers and you for your good behavior and your attention.